Hey there, you're listening to BD4, where there's no better way to get your Yankees and Knicks analysis. Yanks every series, Knicks every game, and MMA on occasion. Here's your host, RJ Carbone.
And a high drive into left center field. Stanley's going to watch another one fly. Are you kidding me? DiVincenzo a three. Bang! Bang! Knicks take a
Take this time to apologize to absolutely nobody.
At the wall. See ya! See ya! See ya! Mr. Nova.
Anthony for three. Bang! That one goes down and the game is tied.
You shook up the world again.
I did it again. But God did it, man. I really just have
Gonna have to. Brunson running away. Oh my! He has been the best player to put on that uniform.
Ball game over. Yankees win. The Yankees win.
All right. So in this episode, fellas, I don't know why I was going to say that. I guess fellas, there's not going to be much of a recap. We're not going to cover a ton of topics. Basically going to talk about one theme. We're not going to get into many other things. No trivia today. It'll be very basic. I don't have any graphics for this episode for those of you watching on YouTube or maybe Spotify. There is a video up, but it's going to be a very straightforward episode as the Knicks lose to the Celtics, because I don't want to remain repetitive, but I do want to continue to press what has been becoming louder and louder and louder over the last couple of years when the Knicks enter these stretches of, I don't want to say hopelessness, but if you're thinking about the macro, doubt. They lose 118-105 to Boston. The score does not depict the way the majority of the game went. I think we are at a point where it's very reasonable to question whether the Knicks disrupted the team dynamic by making the moves they did during the summer. Now, I'm not saying, because this is where I think some people get it wrong, I'm not saying last year's team was better than this year's team. I'm not saying last year's team, if they kept that together, would have won a finals. But I've mentioned this before, even last episode. I feel like they torn the fabric a little bit. And personally, my primary concern, remember when we were going into the offseason last year, it was late in the season, and the Knicks against the Pacers, everybody knew the series was over. You just watched those last couple of games for the hell of it because you're a Knicks fan. But everybody was talking about the offseason at that point, and one of the big topics was, should the Knicks bring in a Donovan Mitchell? And I love Mitchell, but my big primary concern in adding someone like Donovan Mitchell, the initial idea of it, I was the one thing that was holding me back, and the one thing that ultimately pushed me away from the attraction of adding Donovan Mitchell into the equation, was that the Knicks with Donovan Mitchell would have two pick and roll targets. And what they ultimately end up doing, funnily enough, is they don't go out and get Mitchell, obviously, and they get a guy who's completely different in stature, but they essentially still replicated this flaw by acquiring Karl Anthony Towns. And before we dive into this whole thing, Karl Anthony Towns has been an absolute gem for the Knicks. I love him. But even during the rumors, the last couple of years, when the Towns to the Knicks rumors started surfacing a little bit, that was the one thing I really was worried about, was the defense. And would it really work having two screen and roll targets that will be preyed on? And so, given the current roster construct, it's very unlikely the Knicks can attain a championship level defense, even with the three switchable wings that they've got on their first unit. And then you take it a step further, and with the limited flexibility they have in terms of assets and picks and financial situation they're in, I don't know what kind of tweaks with their situation that they can make to this roster in the summer to either get there next year, considering how far the Knicks are from the Celtics. I don't know why I added the word either in there. I didn't have another thought. I don't know how much they can do in one offseason. That's what I'm trying to say. I feel like they may have went a little too far, because they're not just not on the Celtics level. They're in two different leagues. They belong in two different gymnasiums. The Knicks have not earned that respect to play the Boston Celtics in a 48-minute match. It's bad enough that they're not on their level, because that was supposed to be the vision here. But the fact that they're not close to that tier is extremely alarming. And I understand that a lot of it is, like we just said, personnel. But when you're going out there and you're losing these games against these teams, Boston, Cleveland, OKC, by 20, 30, whatever points, consistently, and to be exact, the Knicks are 0-7 against those three teams with an average differential of minus 20 points. To me, that's a little bit more than just roster construction. To me, that's coaching. And I think that's going to eventually get to a point in the postseason where the Knicks front office might finally realize. And that's going to be where my loyalty and my support and my fandom and my love, for lack of a better word, for Tibbs, that's where it stops. You know, I have sat here on this podcast the last number of years since Tibbs has been head coach, and I have, for the most part, I mean, in the beginning it wasn't always pretty, but I have grown into a loyal Tibbs supporter. Right? I love this head coach more than any other head coach or manager, leader in my lifetime. Talking about all my favorite sports teams, maybe other than Joe Torre. I'm a big Tibbs guy. But when it comes down to how I think the Knicks will fare in the postseason with this guy, I'm not sure. In fact, I would lean more towards that. I don't think Tom Thibodeau is that guy. And I think once the Knicks are eliminated in the second round of the postseason this year against the Celtics, if they do get that far, the front office is going to have to look in the mirror. I'm not saying to fire him right here, right now. I'm not saying to fire him then when the Knicks get eliminated this year, if they do. But I do think there's going to come a point, and it needs to be very soon, where they really have to start thinking about, are we optimizing what we have on this roster, right? It's a roster that maybe it's not ready to win a title, but you can also argue at the same time it's pretty damn close. And the way the Knicks have played this year, specifically against these certain teams, they have not shown that they look close. And so that's where I want to transition to, I think, what is the biggest thing above all, above the defensive stuff, above the minutes policing, etc. It continues to be the lineup creativity, right? And this has been, especially the last several weeks, month and a half, been a big talking point here on the show. And so that's what I want to get into here in this episode 809. So let's talk about it the second we return from break here on the podcast. Very much appreciate you all tuning in. Let's get into the show. BD4 is available on social media for those who want to follow. You can find BD4 on Instagram at BD4Pod. You can find us on X at BD4Pod. And you can find us on Facebook by simply searching BD4. Hey guys, just a quick reminder, this podcast is also available in video format on YouTube. So be sure to go over to the YouTube channel, BD4, subscribe, like the videos, comment, and tell me how much I suck or maybe how much you like the video. We'd very much appreciate it. All right, let's get back to it. So, I don't know what I'm going to, on the YouTube page, I have like YouTube chapters in the description of the talking point for each couple of minutes. And I have written down here in my notes, Tom Thibodeau hates spacing. Obviously that's exaggeration, but listen, it's getting to a point where I think he hates spacing, man. Like, hey, it's always going to be size over space for him. And I think that merits truth in certain matchups. But let me ask you something. The Knicks played the Boston Celtics yesterday. For those who are listening, I don't know if anybody listens to this garbage. How many minutes do you think that Tom Thibodeau yesterday played 5 spacers against the Celtics? How many minutes with 5 spacers did the Knicks play yesterday? Now, for whatever reason, I don't know if there's anybody out there who is very new to basketball or doesn't really know what a spacer is. A spacer is one who commands respect of the defense because they can shoot the ball. So basically, how many minutes with 5 shooters on the floor did the Knicks play against the Celtics yesterday? I have the answer right here on my notes, and the answer to that question, 0 minutes. Tibbs did not play a single minute of basketball yesterday with 5 spacers on the floor. And I just feel like against that defense, that Boston Celtics switch everything, rangy, lengthy, big wing defense, that's very unacceptable. When you've got Brunson, when you've got McBride, even Campaign, when you've got Mikal Bridges, when you've got OG Anunoby, Karl Anthony Towns, and I don't know, in theory, Landry Shamet, who has been shooting well lately, that's unacceptable. And the issue with that is usually that's the case. Usually they play very little minutes in games where there are 5 spacers on the floor. It's not often. But to do that against the Boston Celtics, I think is beyond crazy. If you have a better adjective for crazy, please tell me. It's nuts. There continues to be too much Precious Achiuwa and too little Deuce McBride, to put it very simply, right? The floor is not spread nearly enough in those lineups. Even when the Knicks play Precious with Deuce, it kind of defeats the purpose. It's kind of wasting Deuce McBride's minutes. You've got to pair him with guys like OG in that first unit. Precious logging these minutes against these teams is terrifyingly bad. And so the goal going forward, what the goal should have been for the longest time now, to be getting Deuce minutes with the first unit a lot more. And I don't care if it's uncomfortable for you, if it goes against your principles. I don't care how you do it, whether it's starting Deuce, whether it's subbing out Josh Hart earlier, whether it's not only starting Deuce for Hart, but even if you have to start him for Mikal, but stagger Precious and Deuce, or less Precious, less Josh Hart. You shouldn't need to play Hart 40-plus minutes anyway. You got to find a way to get this guy with the first unit a lot more. Right now, Precious Achiuwa's on the floor for far too long. And then he's on the floor with Josh Hart for far too long also. Not to mention, you go to the other side of the floor. Deuce McBride is, far and away your best point of attack guard. Far and away. Mikal Bridges has been fine. He's gotten better over the last couple of months, but he's not your best defender at the point of attack. And so in the second half, you saw how effective Deuce was in that role at the point of attack. But overall, it's just not a sustainable formula. And I just think Tibbs has to optimize the spacing that he's got, because there's enough on the roster to where it should never be this bad. And we're finding examples every single game, and they're not always going to be this extreme in what I'm about to show you here. But there was an example in this game late in the second quarter where the Knicks' floor spacing was beyond horrendous, and it was with Hart and Precious sharing the floor. And I posted this on my Instagram, and I put in the caption what I'm basically about to tell you here. So if you want to go check out this clip of the game, go on my Instagram. It's the latest post, or one of the latest posts, as I'll probably have some of these clips when I'm done. But late in the second quarter, you've got Hart and Precious on, and it's a possession where Boston sees that. So they pre-switch Hart and Towns, where they cross-match those matchups, right? And that's what we've been talking about for the last several months now. You know, they put Horford to Josh, and they put Tatum to Towns. And it eventually ends up where Hart throws an entry pass to Towns on the post. Now, usually when the defense cross matches like this, usually you don't want Josh Hart being the one to throw the entry, because Hart's man will send help to Towns one pass away on the post. Since Hart is not an above the break threat, they'll send help to double the post. And they did exactly that with Al Horford. But you can counter that by cutting Josh Hart off the pass, off the help, and the Knicks did. Right? You want to cut to try and occupy the helper there and get him back to Hart. Except, okay, this is where the Tibbs stuff comes into play. The problem with that was Tibbs also had Precious on the floor. And not only was he on the floor, he was on the weak side corner. So as Hart cuts to the basket, Precious is standing on the weak side corner. So his man, which was Porzingis in this instance, is able to pick up Josh Hart. He tags Josh Hart now, and he doesn't even have to focus or look at Precious, because Precious is not a threat to shoot the basketball. So now Boston's got 4-on-3 on the first side. And so the result of this possession was they double the post. Porzingis picks up Hart. And now Cat forces an incredible late skip pass to Precious on the weak side corner. And it results in an air ball, shot clock violation. It was a bunch of garbage. And that was just one of many examples we see over time of how poor spacing like this can affect the Knicks' offensive ceiling. Those lineups where it's Precious and Hart at the same time, the Knicks are a -3 across 990 possessions. It's supposed to be in there, right? The size is supposed to give you defense. The Knicks' defensive rating in those minutes, 122. That's atrocious. Now, their offensive rating in those lineups is 119, but because Brunson and Towns are superstars and they have to work their ass off in those lineups. So case in point here, that's not a sustainable formula. And it's really disappointing to see teams continue to exploit this. And we're now 70% of the way through the season, and we're still not seeing any adjustments. And even worse is the fact that Tom Thibodeau acknowledged this issue. He acknowledged the issue by starting Deuce McBride in the second half against Boston a few weeks ago. But he hasn't gone back to that. In this game, you saw Hart causing those exact spacing problems, and Tibbs' response to that was to put Precious on the floor with him. Just like against Cleveland a couple of nights ago, you had the same spacing issues, and Tibbs' response to that was, let me go to Precious and Huck. All you're doing when you're doing this is you're allowing Boston, whoever, to exploit your lack of floor space and your lack of shooting. You're only harming yourselves. Now, I will say in this game, Tibbs did make second half adjustments regarding Precious Achiuwa. He sat him in the second half, other than the couple of minutes that Towns had to go to the locker room. Precious Achiuwa didn't play in the second half, just those 4 minutes. He played 14 total minutes in this game. But still, there are too many minutes where there are even only 4 spacers. And it comes down to Hart and Precious versus Deuce McBride, right? And you just need to give him a share of some of those minutes. And listen, like, Hart's going to play. I know that. And Tibbs will play, and he'll start him the rest of the season as long as he's healthy. The Knicks are going to have to find ways to make that work. And it's going to come in a number of ways. Like, Hart's going to have to be more aggressive with his three-point shot. He's not a good three-point shooter, but I also don't think he's such a poor shooter to where defenses should be disrespecting him this much. Like, he's not a 25% shooter. He could shoot below league average a little bit. He'll come close to it. Him not shooting when he's given the space that he's given sometimes, he's kind of allowing it to happen, right? Or drive the open space. I think that's a key. I think, again, using him to cut weak side or just cutting to occupy the help, when Cat's on the post. But again, you can't have Precious weak side. You got to limit lineups with those two on the floor at the same time. And when Hart is out there and when you have the defense cross-matching and a big is on him, you have to use him in the action as much as possible. You want to use him as an initiator, and you want to use him as a screener. And to the Knicks' credit, they did that very well yesterday in the third quarter. They used Hart as a screener, and that opened up a lot of three-point volume for the Knicks, for Brunson against Boston in drop coverage. And like, the Knicks aren't the only NBA team to have these offensive issues versus ghost coverages, right? But the difference with Tibbs coaching is, like, the Knicks, we've also mentioned this a number of times before, the Knicks are so hell-bent. They're so dead set on making the primary action for the designated player that they don't have any counters. And defenses know this. And so I do think they need to get Hart into action more, even if it's getting Bridges into action more, to avoid predictability and to prevent the defense from loading up and help. But at the end of the day, to just simplify it, you see what wins championships in this league, right? It's teams with 5-out spacing who have shooters 1 to 8, capable shooters 1 to 8. It's important. It's very important. And I shouldn't have to be saying this, but it's very important to optimize Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns. That should be what this whole thing is about. This is per hot hand theory. Brunson shoots 9% better at the basket and 9% better on his three-point shot when Deuce McBride is on the floor with him. when Deuce McBride is paired with OG Anunoby, who starts, the Knicks are a plus 16 per 100 possessions. That's a net rating that's in the 98th percentile of all two-man lineups. So the metrics back it up. The fundamentals, the eye test shows you Hart's value is much better with the second unit anyway. His transition full court style of play makes more sense away from Jalen because Jalen is more of a half court point guard who's slower. He likes to get into his sets. And I just think it makes sense. I just think Deuce McBride is one of those players who, even though his numbers might not show it, his impact on the rest of the Knicks, just because the gravity he's got as a spacer, as a shooter, is much more beneficial to the Knicks' upside than when Tibbs is running these non-spacer lineups with him. So that's the big part going forward. It's the lineup creativity, and that to me is going to depict the entire rest of the Tom Thibodeau tenure, however long that may be. And of course, there are other stuff. There's the defense. There's the minutes policing, the injury stuff. Listen, the Cat thing yesterday, he hurt his left knee again. He re-injured it after trying to dunk on Porzingis. He grabs it. He's hobbling to the bench, goes to the locker room for a couple of minutes, and then he returns to the game. 4 minutes and change left. The Knicks are down 18. I'm trying not to flip over it personally. Try not to flip out over it because it's modern NBA, and an 18-point game with 4.5 left is not that much anymore. But I do understand why people are frustrated with it. And then the defensive stuff, I attribute mostly the defensive issues that this team has to personnel. And I actually want to shout out Tom Thibodeau for finally going to something else against the Celtic defense with Cat. And the Knicks found success in switching against them yesterday. Now, the last time they played the Celtics entering yesterday, they were switching Brunson onto Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Yesterday's game, they had Towns switching onto the perimeter. And for the most part, other than a couple of hiccups, it worked. So I think that going forward, a.k.a. when they meet in the playoffs, if they do, all Tatum Porzingis pick and rolls should be an auto switch, just because when you look at who's going to be in those actions for the most part, OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, those two guys, they have the wingspan to play at the 5, to defend at the 5 on those actions. And as we've seen, Towns can be capable of guarding ball on the perimeter. So I think going forward, that should be the coverage they go with for the most part. Switching everything on those pick and rolls. I think it's much more effective than everything else they've tried. And I hope the Knicks learned that from yesterday, because there were still moments, again, where it didn't work. You had some miscommunication with Bridges. The first 3 of the game for Boston, Porzingis knocks it down. Towns switches it. Mikal stays. Porzingis is left open. Middle of the second quarter, Porzingis knocks down another 3. Towns switches. It's Campaign who stays. KP's left open again. Late in the second quarter, Derek White gets a 3 where Brunson goes under. Towns is in a high drop. Open 3. And there were also some possessions between OG and Towns that should have been an auto switch, but they weren't a switch. So they need to figure those out, but I just think it needs to be a switch. You need to switch those because I would rather, against this team, give up the 2-point shot than the 3-point shot at this rate. I would live with the Porzingis mismatch. I would live with the Porzingis mismatch against the Knicks small on the post, as opposed to leaving a wide open 3-point shooter open because you're in drop or you're trying to fight over. They need to switch more. They need to be on. You need to be quick. You need to be on time at your switches. That's going to be key, or else you're going to get beat on the second side. And there were instances of that too yesterday. But like the hedging hasn't worked. Towns is not aggressive enough in hedge. His stance isn't great. His fundamentals and technique are not great. His mobility's awful to where if he doesn't hedge 100% aggressively enough, he's going to get beat on the edges. The guard's going to turn the corner and the Knicks are fucked. Right. And then playing drop obviously hasn't worked against 5-out spacing. You know, Towns and Precious, even moments yesterday where they were in drop coverage and they were murdered in Spain pick and roll, screen to screener, ram screen actions. So I just, at the very least, a positive takeaway from their half-court defense yesterday was that the Knicks were at least showing that they wanted to switch more. Because most of the defensive problems yesterday were in the full court, right? It was not matching up quick enough in transition, semi-transition. So the fact that, you know, Boston scored 118 points, I mean, let's call it 110 non-garbage time points. The defense was fine because the half-court defense held it down. They were willing to switch more. But it's mainly the offensive stuff that continues to worry me more than anything regarding Tom Thibodeau. And that's really it, guys. That's all we got. Not going to dive into anything further. Jalen Brunson was the best Knick on the floor yesterday, so he now has 22 game balls on the year, 22 points yesterday. He was 4 for 9 from 3. I didn't think it was his greatest game. Going to the bench, Shamet was the best Knick among the second unit yesterday. Continues to play better lately. He had 6 points, shot 2 for 3 from 3. He has now 4 game balls with the Knicks this year. And up next for this Knicks team, you've got the Philadelphia 76ers on Wednesday. I will be watching that game. Can't say I'm going to be thrilled or into the game or no matter what the score is, no matter who wins, because at the end of the day, the 25 games that the Knicks have remaining, it's going to be very difficult to put any stock at all into any of them. Even the remaining 3 games that the Knicks have against the Cavs and the Celtics, they have 2 more against Cleveland, I believe, or maybe 1 more against Cleveland, or 2 more and then 1 against Boston. I don't know. They have 3 combined games left against the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavs. All 3 of them come in April, when the standings will pretty much be settled by then. So even those games, there's nothing to really take away from. These were the games the Knicks needed to really show something in. They didn't. Even if it wasn't wins, I just wanted to see them at least be competitive and show that they can compete with this team and be on the same level. The flaws that they're continuing to show on both sides of the floor, lineup-wise, decision-making-wise, it continues to be really day one problems. And that's the most concerning part of this whole thing. So that's all we got in this show. Not even going to get into any more plugs or breaks or anything like that. I'll save you from that in this episode. Going to get right to our outro now. But I do appreciate you all tuning in. Episode 809 of the podcast. That's all we got regarding the Knicks and Celtics. We'll be doing some more Yankees stuff throughout the month. Not much to talk about other than spring training storylines and injuries right now. So can't promise I'll have a lot out lately, but it'll be the usual as we get closer to opening day. And with the Knicks, we'll continue to recap the nightly games. So thank you all. Appreciate you all for tuning in. See you soon. Well, if you made it this far, that means you listened to or watched the entire episode. Thank you. Just remember to follow, subscribe, download, rate and review, and all that fun stuff to help out the podcast. And I will see you in the next episode of BD4.